the stench hit you first. Walking into a medieval kitchen, the smell of rotting fish guts fermenting in clay pots would assault your senses so violently that you stumble backward, gasping for clean air. But to the cook stirring that putrid mixture, it wasn't disgusting. It was dinner. And not just any dinner, but a delicacy that would grace the tables of kings and peasants alike. Picture this: you sitting at a grand feast in the year 1350. The lord of the manor has just presented his most prized dish, a creature that shouldn't exist, stitched together from parts of different animals, roasted to perfection and served on a silver platter. The guests gasp in awe. You reach for your goblet, hoping the wine will calm your nerves, only to discover it's filled with curdled milk mixed with ale. Welcome to medieval dining, where survival and spectacle created the most bizarre cuisine in human history. Today, I am going to take you on a journey through the most horrific foods that medieval people not only ate, but actually craved. These aren't just random oddities that desperate people choked down during famines. These were deliberate culinary choices that defined an entire era. Foods so strange, so disturbing, that they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about our ancestors. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Every single one of these revolting dishes tells us something profound about medieval life, about power, about faith, about the lengths people would go to survive, and about how the line between food and medicine, between necessity and luxury, was drawn in ways that would shock us today. What you're about to discover isn't just a list of gross foods. It's a window into a world where eating tree bark wasn't desperation, it was innovation. Where drinking blood wasn't savage, it was practical. Where serving mythical creatures wasn't madness, it was artistry. I've spent months researching these dishes, digging through medieval cookbooks, medical texts, and first-hand accounts from people who actually ate these things. And I can tell you right now, some of these will turn your stomach, while others might just make you curious enough to wonder what they actually tasted like. The truth is, medieval cuisine was shaped by forces we can barely comprehend today. No refrigeration meant everything spoiled quickly. No global trade meant you ate what grew nearby or you didn't eat at all. No understanding of bacteria meant food safety was a gamble that could kill you. But perhaps most importantly, no separation between food and status meant that what you ate declared who you were to the world. The wealthy didn't just eat to survive. They ate to display their power, their wealth, their connection to the divine. And that led to some truly spectacular culinary madness. Meanwhile, the poor ate to live another day, which meant nothing was too disgusting, too strange, or too dangerous if it would keep them alive through another harsh winter. Let me start with something that perfectly captures the medieval mindset: dormice. Yes, those cute little rodents that look like tiny squirrels. In medieval Europe, these creatures weren't pets or pests. They were a luxury item that would make your mouth water if you had enough gold to afford them. The process was elaborate and deliberate. Wealthy households would catch these animals and fatten them up in special clay containers called gloraria. For weeks, servants would feed them nuts, fruits, and grains until they were plump and tender. Then came the cooking. These dormice were roasted whole, often stuffed with honey, spices, and herbs. The result was a sweet, fatty morsel that melted in your mouth. Now, before you recoil in horror, think about this from a medieval perspective. These weren't just random rodents. They were carefully cultivated, expertly prepared and served at the finest banquets. The fat content provided essential calories during lean times. The preparation showed sophistication and wealth, and the taste, according to contemporary accounts, was absolutely divine. But dormice were just the beginning, because while the wealthy were feasting on honey-glazed rodents, everyone else was dealing with a much more pressing concern. How do you make sure nothing goes to waste when an animal dies? The answer was black pudding. And this wasn't some quaint sausage you'd find at a modern farmer's market. This was congealed pig's blood mixed with oatmeal and fat, stuffed into intestines, and boiled until it formed a dense, iron-rich sausage that could feed a family for days. The process was urgent and messy. When a pig was slaughtered, the blood had to be caught immediately because it spoiled within hours. Cooks would mix this fresh blood with whatever fillers they had available: barley, breadcrumbs, even sawdust in desperate times. The mixture was then stuffed into the animal's own intestines or stomach lining, creating a natural casing that could be boiled or fried. The result was a sausage so dense with nutrients that a single portion could sustain a laborer through a full day of back-breaking work. It was ugly, it was pungent, and it was absolutely essential for survival. But here's the thing that makes black pudding so fascinating. It wasn't just peasant food. Versions of it appeared at royal tables, dressed up with expensive spices and served alongside other delicacies. This brings us to one of the most polarizing substances in medieval cuisine: garum. If you've ever smelled fish sauce in an Asian restaurant and wondered how anyone could eat something so pungent, you're getting a glimpse of what medieval Europeans dealt with every single day. Garum was made by taking fish guts, the parts that would normally be thrown away, and fermenting them with salt and spices for weeks or even months. The process created a liquid so potent that it could clear a room faster than a fire alarm. The smell was overwhelming, described by one medieval writer as worse than a battlefield after 3 days in the sun. Yet this horrific substance was beloved across all social classes. Peasants used it to flavor their bland, grain-based stews. Nobles demanded it for their elaborate sauces. It was the ketchup of the medieval world, except infinitely more powerful and infinitely more disgusting to modern sensibilities. The reason garum was so popular wasn't just its flavor, though contemporary accounts describe it as adding an incredible depth to any dish. It was also incredibly practical. The fermentation process preserved the fish proteins, creating a condiment that could last for months without spoiling. In a world where food preservation was a matter of life and death, garum was liquid gold. But not all medieval foods were about preservation or luxury. Some were about pure survival, and that's where things get truly desperate. When crops failed and grain stores ran empty, medieval bakers had to get creative. And by creative, I mean they started grinding up tree bark and mixing it with whatever flour they had left. Birch bark was the preferred choice because it had a relatively mild flavor and provided some nutritional value. The bark would be dried, ground into powder, and mixed with rye or barley flour to create a coarse, dark bread that was better than starving. But this wasn't just emergency food. Some regions embraced bark bread as a regular part of their diet, believing it offered health benefits like improved digestion. Modern science tells us they weren't entirely wrong. Tree bark contains fiber and antioxidants that would have provided some genuine nutritional value. But imagine biting into a slice of bread and tasting wood. Imagine the texture: gritty and tough, requiring enormous effort to chew and swallow. Yet for medieval people, this was innovation. This was survival. This was turning the forest itself into sustenance. The story of medieval cuisine is ultimately a story about human ingenuity in the face of impossible circumstances. Every bizarre dish, every horrific combination of ingredients, every nauseating preparation method was born from necessity, creativity, or the eternal human desire to transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. But we've only scratched the surface of this culinary nightmare, because what I've shown you so far, the dormice and blood sausages and fermented fish guts, these were just the appetizers. The main course of medieval dining was far more spectacular, far more disturbing, and far more revealing about the people who created it. Because what came next wasn't just food. It was theater. It was art. It was a grotesque masterpiece that would make modern diners question their sanity. Enter the cockatrice, a creature that should never have existed, yet graced the tables of medieval nobility with disturbing regularity. Picture this monstrosity: the upper half of a pig, complete with head and front legs, sewn on to the lower half of a chicken or turkey. The result was a chimera that looked like it had crawled out of a fever dream and onto a dinner plate. The creation of a cockatrice required genuine skill. Cooks had to roast each half separately to ensure proper cooking, then carefully stitch them together using string or metal skewers while both were still hot. The finished product was presented on silver platters, often garnished with herbs and fruits, to enhance the illusion that this impossible creature was somehow natural. But why would anyone create such an abomination? The answer reveals everything about medieval dining culture. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was spectacle. It was a way to demonstrate power, creativity, and the ability to bend nature itself to your will. When a lord served cockatrice to his guests, he wasn't just feeding them. He was showing them that he possessed the resources and audacity to create mythical beasts for their entertainment. The taste, according to surviving accounts, was actually quite pleasant. The pork provided rich fat, while the poultry offered lean protein. But taste was secondary to impact. Imagine being a guest at such a feast, watching servants carry in this impossible creature while musicians played and candles flickered. The psychological effect was profound, creating memories that would last a lifetime and stories that would be retold for generations. Yet, for all its theatrical grandeur, the cockatrice pales in comparison to one of Scotland's most enduring contributions to the medieval menu, haggis. Now, I know what you're thinking. Haggis still exists today, so how horrific could it really be? But medieval haggis was a different beast entirely, both literally and figuratively. The traditional preparation involved taking a sheep's stomach and stuffing it with the animal's heart, liver, lungs, oats, onions, and whatever spices the cook could afford. The entire mixture was then sewn shut and boiled for hours until the organs had broken down into a dense, intensely flavored pudding. Think about what you're really eating here. You're consuming the filtration system of a sheep, stuffed with its respiratory and circulatory organs, seasoned with grains that had been soaked in the animal's digestive juices. The texture was described by one medieval chronicler as resembling wet sand mixed with clay. The flavor was so intense that first-time eaters often vomited before they could finish a portion. But here's what makes haggis truly fascinating from a historical perspective. This wasn't desperate survival food. This was cultural identity transformed into cuisine. For medieval Scots, haggis represented efficiency, resourcefulness, and respect for the animal that had given its life. Every part was used, nothing was wasted, and the result was a dish that could feed an entire family while providing enough calories to survive harsh highland winters. The preparation was also deeply communal. Families would gather to clean the organs, mix the stuffing, and monitor the cooking process. The making of haggis became a social event that reinforced clan bonds and passed down traditions from one generation to the next. In a way, you weren't just eating food, you were consuming history, culture, and community solidarity. But medieval cooks didn't stop at reorganizing animal parts. They also had a peculiar talent for blurring the lines between sweet and savory in ways that would confuse modern palates. Enter blancmange, or, as it was known then, blanc manger. This wasn't the simple pudding we know today. This was a dish that combined shredded chicken breast with almond milk, rice, and sugar to create something that existed in culinary limbo. The preparation was labor-intensive and expensive. Chicken breast had to be pounded into fine threads, then mixed with milk extracted from ground almonds. Rice was added for texture, along with sugar that cost more than most people earned in a month. The entire mixture was strained through fine cloth until it achieved a silky consistency, then molded into elaborate shapes before serving. The result was a dish that tasted simultaneously like dessert and dinner. The chicken provided protein, while the almonds and sugar offered sweetness. But the combination was so unusual that many diners could undecide whether they were eating the main course or dessert. Some medieval cookbooks suggest serving blanc manger between other courses, as if the cooks themselves weren't sure where it belonged in the meal. What makes blanc manger particularly interesting is how it reflects medieval attitudes toward food categories. Modern cuisine maintains strict boundaries between sweet and savory, but medieval cooks saw no such limitations. If an ingredient was expensive and difficult to obtain, it belonged in the most elaborate dishes, regardless of whether it made logical sense to contemporary tastes. This willingness to experiment extended beyond mere ingredient combinations. Medieval diners also had remarkably flexible interpretations of what constituted meat, especially during religious fasting periods. Which brings us to one of the most ingenious dietary loopholes in culinary history: beaver tail. During Lent, Christians were forbidden from eating meat, but clever medieval monks discovered what they considered a theological technicality. Since beavers spent most of their time in water, swimming and diving like fish, surely they must be more aquatic than terrestrial. Therefore, consuming beaver tail couldn't possibly violate religious dietary restrictions. The logic was questionable, but the church authorities allowed it, and beaver tail became a Lenten delicacy throughout medieval Europe. The preparation was surprisingly sophisticated. The tail was skinned, then roasted or fried until the skin became crispy while the interior remained tender. The texture was described as similar to fish, though much fattier and more substantial, rich in collagen and fat. Beaver tail provided essential nutrients during fasting periods when other protein sources were forbidden. But more importantly, it allowed religious communities to maintain the spirit of sacrifice while still enjoying what was essentially a luxury food. The mental gymnastics required to justify eating a furry, warm-blooded mammal during a period of supposed abstinence reveals just how creative medieval people could be. When hunger met religious obligation, this flexibility extended to beverages as well. Which brings us to one of the strangest drinks ever consumed by human beings: Posset. Imagine curdled milk floating on top of hot ale, sweetened with honey and spiced with cinnamon. Now imagine drinking this concoction not just for pleasure, but as medicine for everything from colds to digestive problems. The preparation of posset was both art and chemistry. Hot ale was poured into milk, causing it to curdle immediately. The curds would float to the surface, creating a custard-like layer that drinkers scooped up with spoons while sipping the alcoholic whey underneath. The combination was supposed to provide the nutritional benefits of dairy with the medicinal properties of alcohol and spices. Contemporary accounts describe posset as tasting like liquid cheese mixed with beer, which sounds absolutely revolting to modern sensibilities. But medieval people consumed it with enthusiasm, believing it could cure illnesses, aid digestion, and provide comfort during cold winter nights. The drink was so popular that elaborate posset cups became status symbols, crafted from silver and decorated with precious stones. What's particularly fascinating about posset is how it demonstrates the medieval tendency to combine food and medicine into single preparations. This wasn't just a drink, it was a therapeutic intervention that happened to taste good, or at least good enough to justify its consumption for health benefits. But perhaps no aspect of medieval cuisine reveals more about the period's relationship with food than the practice of competitive extravagance among the wealthy. This wasn't just about eating unusual ingredients. It was about pushing the boundaries of what was possible, regardless of cost, practicality, or sanity. The ultimate expression of this madness was the medieval fascination with live animals at banquets. Not just serving animals, but presenting them alive, then killing and preparing them in front of guests as entertainment. Picture this horrifying spectacle: a swan, its feathers carefully plucked and then sewn back on, would be paraded before diners while still breathing. The bird would then be slaughtered, roasted, and served with its original plumage restored to create the illusion that it had simply fallen asleep on the platter. But the swan was just the opening act. The main event was often a peacock, subjected to an even more elaborate torture. The bird would be skinned with surgical precision, keeping the feathers and head intact. After roasting the meat, cooks would reconstruct the entire animal, sewing the cooked flesh back into its original skin and positioning it as if it were still alive. Some ambitious chefs even soaked the beak in alcohol and set it on fire, creating a grotesque torch that illuminated the feast while filling the hall with the stench of burning bird. The psychological impact was intentional and devastating. Guests weren't just eating dinner, they were witnessing a resurrection performance that bordered on necromancy. The message was unmistakable. The host possessed such wealth and power that he could command nature itself, bringing the dead back to apparent life for their amusement. Yet, for all these theatrical horrors, the most dangerous aspect of medieval dining wasn't what people ate, but what they didn't know about what they were eating. Ergot, a fungus that grew on rye grain, caused hallucinations, convulsions, and agonizing death. Entire villages would be struck with mysterious madness after eating contaminated bread, leading to accusations of witchcraft and mass hysteria. The symptoms were terrifying and unpredictable. Victims would experience burning sensations in their limbs, followed by violent convulsions and vivid hallucinations. Some would see demons dancing on their dinner tables. Others would believe their neighbors had transformed into wild animals. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones suffered for weeks, their minds shattered by chemical psychosis they couldn't understand or escape. But ergot poisoning wasn't the only hidden danger lurking in medieval kitchens. Lamprey blood, if consumed raw, contained toxins that could kill within hours. Lead poisoning from pewter dishes caused madness and death among the wealthy. Even sugar, that ultimate symbol of medieval luxury, rotted teeth so severely that many nobles died from infections that spread from their mouths to their brains. The irony was crushing. The wealthier you were, the more elaborate your food, the more likely you were to die from what you ate. Peasants consuming simple pottage and black bread often outlived nobles who dined on exotic delicacies, prepared with dangerous ingredients and served on toxic tableware. This brings us to the final, most disturbing truth about medieval cuisine. For all its strangeness, all its apparent madness, every single one of these horrific foods made perfect sense within its historical context. Dormice weren't disgusting treats for sadistic nobles. They were efficient protein sources that required minimal resources to produce. Black pudding wasn't a revolting waste product. It was brilliant food preservation that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Even the most theatrical presentations served practical purposes. The cockatrice wasn't just grotesque entertainment. It was a demonstration of political power that could influence alliances, intimidate enemies, and secure loyalty from vassals. When you could afford to waste time and resources creating mythical beasts for dinner, you were advertising your strength to anyone who might challenge your authority. The tree-barked bread that sounds so desperate to modern ears was actually sophisticated adaptation to environmental challenges. Medieval bakers had discovered that certain barks contained nutrients and fibers that could supplement limited grain supplies. They weren't eating wood because they were starving. They were eating wood because they had figured out how to make the forest itself into farmland. Perhaps most remarkably, many of these seemingly primitive food practices were actually more sustainable and nutritionally complete than modern diets. The nose-to-tail eating that created haggis and black pudding ensured that nothing was wasted and that people consumed organs, rich in vitamins and minerals that are often lacking in contemporary cuisine. The fermented fish sauces that smell so revolting to us provided essential amino acids and preserved proteins for months without refrigeration. The combination of meat and fruit in medieval dishes created flavor profiles that enhanced nutrient absorption and provided balanced nutrition in ways that modern food science is only beginning to understand. So the next time you sit down to a meal, remember the culinary pioneers who came before us, the medieval cooks who transformed necessity into artistry, who turned survival into spectacle, and who proved that human creativity knows no bounds when hunger and imagination collide. Their legacy lives on in dishes we still enjoy today. Haggis remains a proud Scottish tradition. Black pudding appears on breakfast plates across Europe. Even the spirit of the cockatrice survives in elaborate wedding cakes and competitive cooking shows where chefs create impossible combinations for shock value and entertainment. These weren't savage people eating disgusting food because they didn't know better. These were our ancestors, adapting to their world with the same intelligence and resourcefulness that we use to adapt to ours. They just happened to live in a time when adaptation meant eating things that would horrify us today. The real horror isn't what they ate. It's imagining what future generations will think of our own food choices, our factory-farmed meat, our processed chemicals, our plastic packaging that will outlast our civilization. Perhaps in 500 years, people will look back at our happy meals and energy drinks with the same mixture of fascination and revulsion that we feel toward medieval cuisine. The wheel of culinary judgment keeps turning. Today's delicacy becomes tomorrow's disgust. Today's necessity becomes tomorrow's curiosity. And today's innovation becomes tomorrow's horror story, told by future historians who can't quite believe that people once ate such things. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history's most disturbing dinner table. Make sure to subscribe for more dark tales from our past, and let me know in the comments which of these medieval foods disturbed you the most. Because trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what our ancestors were willing to put in their mouths.